The phone in Daniel Hart's pocket buzzed 3 times before he even noticed his hands were shaking. He was standing in the middle of a construction site, blueprints rolled under his arm, when his vision suddenly blurred and his chest tightened like someone had wrapped a rope around his ribs and pulled hard. He dropped to one knee. Workers around him shouted his name, but their voices sounded far away, like they were calling him from the bottom of a well. The last thing he remembered before the world went dark was the sound of a hard hat clattering against concrete, and then nothing. When Daniel opened his eyes again, white lights burned above him. A steady beeping filled the room. He was lying in a hospital bed, an oxygen tube resting under his nose, and a nurse was adjusting a monitor beside him. For a moment, he thought it was all a dream, some strange nightmare his mind had cooked up after a long day of work. Then the pain in his chest reminded him it was very real. A doctor entered the room a few minutes later, holding a folder against his chest like it carried the weight of the world. His name tag read Dr. Akaffer. He pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down slowly, the kind of slow that told Daniel this was not going to be good news. "Mr. Hart," the doctor said gently, "you collapsed at your workplace today. We ran several tests while you were unconscious, and I want to walk you through what we found." Daniel swallowed hard. His throat felt dry and his mind raced through 100 possibilities in half a second. "Just tell me straight," he said. "I can handle it." The doctor nodded and opened the folder. "You have a condition called dilated cardiomyopathy. In simple terms, your heart muscle has become weak and enlarged. It is not pumping blood the way it should. This is a serious condition, and unfortunately in your case, it appears to be progressing faster than we would like." Daniel stared at the ceiling, trying to process the words. He had always considered himself healthy. He ran 3 miles every morning before work. He rarely got sick. He was only 34 years old with an entire life ahead of him, a life he had already begun building with the woman he loved. "How bad is it?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We will need to monitor you closely," Dr. Akaffer said. "With medication, lifestyle changes, and regular checkups, some patients manage this condition for many years. Others, unfortunately, decline faster. I won't lie to you, Mr. Hart. This is something you will be dealing with for the rest of your life, and depending on how your body responds, it could shorten that life significantly." The room went silent except for the steady beep of the heart monitor, a sound that suddenly felt like a countdown clock ticking in the background of his existence. Daniel thought about his job, his apartment, his mother back home who still called him every Sunday evening, but mostly he thought about Elena Brooks. Elena was the woman he had been planning to marry. They had been together for 5 years, ever since they met at a small coffee shop near the university where she used to work as an assistant teacher. She had spilled coffee on his sketchbook that day, laughed nervously, and offered to buy him a new one. He told her a new coffee would be enough. That small, clumsy moment had turned into 5 years of laughter, late-night conversations, road trips with bad music, and quiet mornings where neither of them wanted to get out of bed. He had proposed to her 3 months earlier on a hill overlooking the city, with the sun setting behind them in shades of orange and pink. Elena had cried, laughed, and said yes before he even finished his sentence. They had already started looking at venues. She had shown him pictures of dresses she liked, careful not to reveal too much, teasing him that he would have to wait to see the real one. Now, lying in a hospital bed with wires attached to his chest, Daniel felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just fear of dying, it was fear of what his dying would do to her. He pictured Elena sitting beside a hospital bed for years, watching him grow weaker, canceling her own plans to take care of him, missing opportunities because she refused to leave his side. He pictured her crying alone in waiting rooms, exhausted from sleepless nights, slowly losing pieces of her own life while trying to hold on to his. The image made his chest hurt more than the actual illness did. Dr. Akaffer continued speaking, explaining medications, follow-up appointments, and lifestyle adjustments Daniel would need to make. Daniel nodded along, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. He was thinking about the wedding photos they hadn't taken yet, the children they had talked about naming, the small house with a garden Elena always dreamed of. He was thinking about all of it slipping away, not because he would die, but because of how long the dying might take and what it would cost her. Later that evening, Elena rushed into the hospital room, her hair messy, her eyes red from crying in the car. She had received a call from one of Daniel's coworkers and driven straight over without even changing out of her work clothes. The moment she saw him sitting up in the hospital bed, awake and breathing, she let out a shaky breath of relief and rushed to his side, wrapping her arms around him carefully, mindful of the wires and tubes. "You scared me half to death," she whispered into his shoulder. "Why didn't anyone call me sooner?" Daniel held her, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, memorizing the way her arms felt around him. Part of him wanted to tell her everything immediately, to let her cry with him, to let her be the strong partner she had always been. But another part of him, a quieter and more frightened part, was already building walls he didn't fully understand yet. "I'm okay," he said softly, even though he wasn't sure that was true. "The doctors are running tests. I probably just overworked myself." Elena pulled back slightly, studying his face with the kind of attention only someone who truly loves another person can have. "Daniel, you collapsed. That's not normal. What did the doctor say?" He hesitated just for a second, but that second felt like an eternity. "They think it might be my blood pressure. Stress, maybe. I'll get more results tomorrow." The lie slipped out easily, far too easily, and something about that scared him more than the diagnosis itself. He told himself he wasn't ready to tell her yet, that he needed time to process it first, that he wanted to protect her from unnecessary worry until he had all the facts. But deep down, a different fear was already taking root, one that would grow over the coming days into something far more dangerous than his failing heart. That night, after Elena had fallen asleep in the uncomfortable hospital chair beside his bed, her hand still resting on his arm, Daniel lay awake staring at the ceiling. He thought about his father, who had passed away when Daniel was just 16. He remembered the years leading up to his father's death, how his mother had slowly faded alongside him, exhausted from years of hospital visits, medications, and the constant fear of losing the man she loved. He remembered how much of herself she had lost in the process, how the vibrant, laughing woman he once knew had become quiet and hollow by the time his father finally passed. Daniel could not let that happen to Elena. She was only 32, full of dreams, ambition, and a future that stretched out endlessly in front of her. She wanted to open her own tutoring center one day. She wanted to travel to places she had only seen in magazines. She wanted children, a family, a life filled with laughter rather than hospital corridors and worried whispers with doctors. If he told her the truth now, she would stay. He knew that without a single doubt. Elena was the kind of person who did not run from difficulty, who faced challenges head-on, who loved fiercely and completely. She would sacrifice her own dreams for him without hesitation, and that was exactly what terrified him. He did not want to become the reason her light dimmed. He did not want her best years spent as a caretaker, instead of as the vibrant woman she was meant to be. A dangerous thought began forming in his mind that night, one that felt noble and selfless at the time, though it would later prove to be the most painful mistake of his life. He began to wonder if the kindest thing he could do, the most loving thing, would be to push her away before she could sacrifice everything for him. If she left now, while she was still young, she could rebuild her life, find happiness, chase her dreams without the weight of his illness holding her back. It was a thought born from love, twisted by fear, and wrapped in the belief that suffering alone was somehow noble. He did not yet understand that this kind of sacrifice, hidden behind lies, would not protect Elena at all. Instead, it would cause a different kind of pain, one built on confusion, rejection, and heartbreak, a pain that could have been avoided entirely with simple honesty. The next morning, more tests confirmed what Dr. Acaffer had already suspected. Daniel's heart function was significantly reduced. He would need daily medication, regular monitoring, and eventually, if his condition worsened, he might require more serious interventions. The doctor spoke with careful optimism, explaining that many patients lived full lives with proper care and support, but Daniel barely heard the hopeful parts. His mind had already latched onto the darkest possibilities, and fear had begun making decisions that logic and love should have made instead. When Elena asked him again what the doctors had said, Daniel gave her a softened version of the truth, mentioning a heart condition but downplaying its severity, telling her it was manageable, that he would be fine with a few lifestyle changes. He watched her face relax with relief, and he felt a heavy guilt settle into his stomach, knowing he was not being fully honest with her. But he told himself it was temporary, that he simply needed time to figure out his next steps before involving her completely. Over the following days, as Daniel was discharged and returned home, he found himself replaying his father's final years over and over in his mind. Every memory of his mother's exhaustion, every quiet moment where he had seen her cry alone in the kitchen thinking no one was watching, fueled the belief growing inside him. He convinced himself that love sometimes meant letting go, that protecting someone did not always mean holding on tightly, and that his responsibility now was to shield Elena from a future he was certain would break her. He did not yet understand that this decision, made from a place of fear rather than trust, would set into motion a chain of events far more devastating than his illness alone ever could. He did not yet understand that the walls he was preparing to build around his heart would not protect Elena at all. Instead, they would push away the very person capable of helping him survive, both physically and emotionally, leaving them both broken in ways that honesty could have prevented. As Daniel sat alone in his apartment that first night home from the hospital, staring at an old photograph of him and Elena laughing on a beach during their first vacation together, he made a decision that would change everything. He decided he would distance himself from her, slowly and carefully, so she would not suspect the real reason behind his change. He told himself it was the only way to give her the future she deserved. He had no idea in that quiet, fearful moment just how wrong he truly was. Elena noticed the change before Daniel even realized how obvious he had become. It started with small things, the kind of small things that seem insignificant on their own but begin to form a pattern when strung together. He stopped replying to her messages as quickly as he used to. He canceled dinner plans twice in 1 week, claiming exhaustion from work, even though he had never let exhaustion stop him from seeing her before. He stopped reaching for her hand during their evening walks, and when she reached for his instead, he would hold it for only a few seconds before finding some reason to pull away. At first, Elena told herself she was imagining things. She reminded herself that Daniel had just been through a frightening health scare, that perhaps he needed space to process everything that had happened. She gave him room, careful not to push too hard, trusting that whatever was bothering him would pass with time. But as days turned into 2 weeks, the distance between them grew wider instead of smaller, and Elena's patience began wearing thin. One evening, she arrived at his apartment with a bag of groceries, planning to cook his favorite meal, hoping a quiet dinner together might bring back some of the warmth that seemed to have disappeared. She let herself in with the spare key he had given her over a year ago, calling his name as she set the bags on the kitchen counter. Daniel appeared from the bedroom, and the look on his face was not one of joy or surprise. It was closer to discomfort, almost like he had been caught doing something he shouldn't have. "Elena, I wasn't expecting you tonight," he said, his voice flat. "I wanted to surprise you," she replied, forcing a smile despite the unease creeping into her chest. "I thought we could use a nice dinner together. We haven't really talked much lately." "I already ate," Daniel lied, glancing away from her. "You should have called first." The words hit her harder than he probably intended. Elena stood there for a moment, processing the coldness in his tone, searching his face for any sign of the man she had fallen in love with 5 years earlier. She found nothing familiar in his expression, only a distant stranger wearing his face. "Daniel, what is going on with you?" she asked, setting down the vegetable she had been holding. "You've been different for weeks now. Ever since you got out of the hospital, it's like you're a completely different person. Talk to me, please." He turned away from her, running a hand through his hair, his back tense and rigid. Every part of him wanted to turn around, pull her into his arms, and tell her everything, the diagnosis, the fear, the countdown clock he now carried inside his chest. But the fear of watching her sacrifice her future for his uncertain present kept his mouth firmly shut. "I've just been thinking a lot," he finally said, his voice carefully controlled. "About us. About what I actually want." Elena felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean, what you want? We're engaged, Daniel. We're supposed to be building a life together." "Maybe I rushed into that," he said, the words tasting like poison as they left his mouth. He hated himself for saying them, but he pushed forward anyway, convinced that hurting her now would somehow save her later. "Maybe I proposed because I was scared of being alone, not because I was actually ready for marriage." The kitchen fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Elena's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall, her jaw tightening as she tried to process what she was hearing. 5 years of memories, 5 years of building a future together, seemed to be crumbling in front of her in the span of a single conversation. "You proposed on top of that hill," she said quietly, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "You told me you had never been more certain of anything in your entire life. Was that a lie too?" Daniel's chest tightened, and this time it had nothing to do with his failing heart. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to stop this cruel performance, to tell her the truth, to beg for her forgiveness and her presence by his side. But the image of her exhausted, drained, and trapped by his illness kept his resolve intact, even as it broke something inside both of them. I don't know what I was feeling that day, he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. But right now, I think we need to take a step back. This isn't working the way I thought it would. Alina stared at him for a long moment, searching for any crack in his armor, any sign that this was some kind of misunderstanding she could fix. But Daniel had spent weeks building this wall, rehearsing this exact moment in his mind, preparing himself to be convincing enough that she would not question him further. He hated every second of it, but he did not let that hatred show on his face. "Fine," Alina finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. She reached for her engagement ring, twisting it off her finger with trembling hands, and placed it gently on the kitchen counter between them. "If this is really what you want, then I won't beg you to stay. I deserve someone who is certain about loving me." She grabbed her bag, leaving the groceries untouched on the counter, and walked toward the door. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, as if her legs did not want to carry her away from the man she had built her entire future around. At the doorway, she paused and turned back to look at him one final time. "I hope whatever you're looking for you find it," she said, her voice cracking despite her attempt to remain composed. "Because clearly it wasn't me." The door closed behind her with a soft click that echoed through the apartment like a gunshot. Daniel stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the ring she had left behind, the ring he had saved for months to afford, the ring that was supposed to symbolize forever. His legs gave out beneath him, and he sank to the kitchen floor, his back against the cabinet, silent sobs shaking his entire body. He had done it. He had successfully pushed away the woman he loved more than his own life, convinced himself it was an act of sacrifice rather than an act of self-destruction. But sitting there on the cold kitchen tile, surrounded by unused groceries and the echo of her final words, Daniel did not feel noble. He did not feel like he had protected anyone. He felt like he had just made the single worst decision of his entire existence. Outside, in her car, Alina sat behind the steering wheel for nearly 20 minutes before she found the strength to drive. Tears streamed down her face uncontrollably, 5 years of memories replaying in her mind like a film reel she could not pause. She thought about their first date, the nervous way he had spilled his own drink trying to impress her after she spilled coffee on him. She thought about the countless nights they had stayed up talking about their dreams, their fears, their hopes for a future together. She thought about the way he used to look at her, like she was the answer to every question he had ever asked in his life. None of it made sense to her. Daniel had never been the type of man to make impulsive decisions, let alone unravel an entire relationship over the course of a single conversation. Something felt deeply wrong about the entire situation, but grief and humiliation clouded her judgment, and she could not bring herself to consider that he might be hiding something far more serious than cold feet. She called her older sister, Grace, the moment she arrived home, her voice breaking as she recounted everything that had happened. Grace listened patiently, offering comfort through the phone, but even she seemed confused by the sudden shift in Daniel's behavior. "This doesn't sound like him at all," Grace said carefully. "Are you sure something else isn't going on? Didn't you say he was in the hospital recently?" "He said it was nothing serious," Alina replied, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Just stress and blood pressure." "Maybe he's just not the man I thought he was, Grace. Maybe I was seeing what I wanted to see this whole time instead of who he actually was." But even as she said the words, doubt lingered in the back of her mind, a small, persistent voice telling her that something about Daniel's sudden change simply did not add up. She pushed the thought aside, too exhausted and heartbroken to chase answers that felt increasingly out of reach. Instead, she allowed herself to grieve the relationship she believed had ended, unaware that the man she loved was, at that very moment, grieving right alongside her, separated only by a door and a lie he refused to take back. Over the following days, Alina threw herself into distractions, spending extra hours at her tutoring job, avoiding places that reminded her of Daniel, deleting old photographs from her phone even though each deletion felt like tearing open a fresh wound. She told herself she was healing, moving forward, reclaiming the future he had apparently decided he no longer wanted to share with her. Meanwhile, Daniel sank deeper into isolation, spending his evenings staring at his phone, rereading old messages from Alina that he refused to delete, torturing himself with memories of a happiness he had willingly destroyed. He told himself repeatedly that this was for her own good, that she would eventually find someone healthy, someone who could give her the uncomplicated future she deserved. But every night, as he lay alone in a bed that still smelled faintly of her perfume, he questioned whether his sacrifice was truly an act of love, or simply the loneliest mistake he would ever make. He had no way of knowing yet just how far this decision would push both of their lives into darkness, nor did he realize that true love rarely survives on silence and lies, no matter how well-intentioned those lies might be. 3 months passed, and the seasons shifted from the warmth of late summer into the sharp chill of early winter. Daniel had returned to work, though his coworkers noticed he was quieter than before, less inclined to join conversations during lunch breaks, more likely to eat alone at his desk staring blankly at his computer screen. He had told his closest friend, Marcus Webb, only that he and Alina had broken up, offering no further explanation despite Marcus pressing him for details on several occasions. Marcus had known Daniel since college, the kind of friendship built on years of shared history, late-night study sessions, and enough inside jokes to fill an entire book. He had watched Daniel and Alina's relationship grow from nervous first dates into something that felt permanent, something that felt inevitable. So when Daniel casually mentioned they had ended things, offering nothing more than a shrug and a change of subject, Marcus knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. "You proposed to that woman 3 months before this," Marcus said one evening, sitting across from Daniel at a small diner they used to frequent during their college years. "People don't just fall out of love that fast, Daniel. Not real love, anyway. What actually happened?" Daniel stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, avoiding eye contact with his oldest friend. "Things change, Marcus. People change. It's not always some big dramatic story." "Bullshit," Marcus replied bluntly, earning a tired glance from Daniel. "I've known you for over 15 years. I know when you're hiding something. You've been distant, you've lost weight, and you barely eat anymore. This isn't just heartbreak. Something else is going on with you." Daniel felt his throat tighten, the familiar urge to confess everything rising up inside him like a wave he could barely hold back. Part of him desperately wanted to unload the truth onto someone, anyone, to finally stop carrying this weight entirely alone. But years of stubborn pride and misguided self-sacrifice kept the words locked behind his teeth. "I appreciate you worrying about me," Daniel finally said, forcing a small, unconvincing smile. "But I'm handling things fine, I just need time." Marcus studied his friend carefully, unconvinced but unwilling to push further that particular evening. He decided to let the subject rest for now, though the concern in his eyes remained long after their conversation ended. What Marcus did not know, and what Daniel refused to admit even to himself most days, was that his condition had begun quietly worsening. He had missed 2 follow-up appointments with Dr. Acaffer, telling himself he simply forgot, though deep down he understood the truth was closer to avoidance. Facing the doctor meant facing the reality of his illness, and facing that reality alone, without Alina's comforting presence beside him, felt unbearable in ways he had not anticipated when he made his original decision to push her away. His medication regimen had become inconsistent as well. Some mornings he forgot to take his pills entirely, distracted by the emptiness of his apartment and the silence that used to be filled with Alina's morning humming as she made coffee in his kitchen. Other days he took his medication but skipped the follow-up blood tests meant to monitor how his body was responding to treatment. Slowly, without fully realizing the danger he was placing himself in, Daniel had begun neglecting the very care that could have kept his condition stable. Meanwhile, Alina had thrown herself completely into rebuilding her own life, though healing proved far slower and more painful than she had initially anticipated. She had moved into a small apartment closer to her sister Grace, hoping the change of scenery might help her forget the life she had planned with Daniel. She had picked up extra tutoring clients, filling her schedule so completely that she barely had time to think about anything beyond lesson plans and student progress reports. But grief has a way of finding quiet moments to resurface, no matter how busy a person keeps themselves. Alina would catch herself staring at old photographs stored on her laptop, unable to bring herself to delete the memories entirely despite deleting them from her phone months earlier. She would hear a song on the radio that reminded her of a road trip they had taken together, and she would have to pull her car over until the tears passed enough for her to see the road clearly again. Grace worried constantly about her younger sister, watching her withdraw socially, decline invitations to gatherings she used to enjoy, and speak less and less about the future she once excitedly discussed with anyone willing to listen. One evening, over dinner at Grace's apartment, she gently broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind for weeks. "Have you ever considered that Daniel's explanation just didn't make sense?" Grace asked carefully, watching Alina push food around her plate without actually eating much of it. "You told me he seemed scared, not angry, when he broke things off. Scared people usually push others away because they're protecting themselves from something, not because they've simply stopped caring. Alina set down her fork, considering her sister's words for the first time with genuine seriousness rather than dismissing them as she had done in previous conversations. "What are you trying to say, Grace?" "I'm saying maybe you should talk to him again," Grace replied gently. "Not to get back together necessarily, but just to understand. You deserve real closure, Alina, not whatever half-explanation he gave you that night. And honestly, something about that hospital visit right before everything fell apart has never sat right with me." The thought lingered in Alina's mind for days afterward, refusing to fully leave despite her attempts to push it away. She told herself reaching out would only reopen wounds that were slowly beginning to heal, that Daniel had made his feelings clear, and pursuing answers would only prolong her own pain unnecessarily. Yet the nagging feeling that something did not add up refused to disappear entirely. Around the same time, Daniel's health took a noticeable turn for the worse. He began experiencing shortness of breath during simple daily tasks, activities that should have been effortless for a man his age. Climbing the stairs to his apartment left him winded and dizzy. His ankles had started swelling by the end of each workday, a symptom he recognized from his research but chose to ignore rather than address properly with his doctor. He told himself it was simply stress, exhaustion from work, anything other than the truth staring him directly in the face. Marcus noticed the physical changes as well, growing increasingly concerned each time he saw his friend. Daniel had lost a noticeable amount of weight, dark circles had formed permanently beneath his eyes, and his usually confident posture had become slumped and tired-looking. During one of their weekly dinners, Marcus finally confronted him directly, refusing to let the conversation slip away this time. "Daniel, you look sick," Marcus said bluntly, setting down his fork and staring directly at his friend across the table. "Not sad sick, actually physically sick. What is really going on with you? And don't give me that same tired excuse about just needing time. I'm not buying it anymore." Daniel felt trapped, cornered by his own carefully constructed lies, finally beginning to crumble under the weight of physical evidence he could no longer easily explain away. He considered deflecting again, offering another vague excuse about stress or poor sleep, but something in Marcus's expression, a genuine fear mixed with unwavering loyalty, broke through the walls he had spent months carefully building. "I have a heart condition," Daniel finally admitted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them, relief and terror washing over him simultaneously. "Dilated cardiomyopathy. That's what put me in the hospital months ago. It's serious, Marcus. The kind of serious that doesn't just go away." Marcus's face shifted from confusion to shock, then quickly settled into something closer to anger. "Are you kidding me right now? You've been carrying this alone this entire time. And Alina, does she know?" Daniel shook his head slowly, shame washing over his features as he finally spoke the truth he had been avoiding for months. "That's why I ended things with her. I couldn't watch her sacrifice everything to take care of me. I couldn't put her through years of hospital visits, watching me get worse, watching me possibly die slowly in front of her. I thought pushing her away was the kindest thing I could do." Marcus stared at his friend in stunned silence for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what Daniel had just confessed. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a mixture of disbelief and frustration that Daniel had not expected. "That is the single most selfish thing disguised as selflessness I have ever heard in my entire life," Marcus said sharply. "Do you have any idea what you've actually done? You didn't protect Alina from pain, Daniel. You just replaced one kind of pain with another. Instead of loving you through a difficult situation, she's now sitting somewhere believing the entire relationship, 5 years of her life, meant nothing to you. You didn't spare her from suffering. You just changed what kind of suffering she's dealing with." The words hit Daniel harder than he expected, cutting through months of carefully rationalized justification he had built around his decision. He had told himself repeatedly that he was being noble, that his sacrifice was an act of love rather than cowardice. But hearing Marcus lay it out so plainly, he began to see the situation from an angle he had refused to consider until that exact moment. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Daniel said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were scared," Marcus replied, his tone softening slightly as he watched his friend's composure begin to crack. "And fear makes people do stupid things, even when those things come from a place of love. But Daniel, you need to fix this before it's too late. You need to see your doctor again, take your medication seriously, and you need to tell Alina the truth, all of it. She deserves that much, and honestly, so do you." Daniel sat in silence for a long time, staring at the half-eaten food in front of him, Marcus's words echoing repeatedly in his mind. He knew his friend was right, had probably known it for months if he was being completely honest with himself. But pride, shame, and fear of rejection after everything he had already put Alina through kept him frozen, uncertain of how to even begin repairing the damage he had caused. "What if she hates me now?" Daniel finally asked, his voice small and vulnerable in a way Marcus rarely heard from him. "What if it's already too late to fix any of this?" "Then at least she'll hate you knowing the truth," Marcus said firmly, instead of believing a lie that makes her question her own worth. "You owe her honesty, Daniel, regardless of how she chooses to respond to it. But you need to take care of yourself first. Call your doctor tomorrow morning." "I mean it." That night, after returning to his empty apartment, Daniel finally sat down and called Dr. Akafer's office, scheduling an appointment for later that week. He also pulled out his phone, staring at Alina's contact information for nearly an hour, drafting and deleting messages repeatedly, unable to find the right words to begin repairing months of carefully constructed lies. Eventually, exhaustion overcame him, and he fell asleep with his phone still in his hand, the message field left blank, the courage to send anything still entirely out of reach. He did not yet know that time was running shorter than he realized, and that his hesitation, born from shame rather than continued selflessness, would soon cost him more than he could have ever imagined. The appointment with Dr. Akafer did not go the way Daniel had hoped. Sitting in the small examination room, listening to the results of tests he had avoided for months, Daniel felt the full weight of his neglect settle heavily onto his shoulders. His heart function had declined further since his last proper checkup. Fluid had begun building around his lungs, a dangerous symptom that explained the constant shortness of breath he had been dismissing as simple exhaustion. "Mr. Hart, I need to be direct with you," Dr. Akafer said, his expression serious as he reviewed the charts in front of him. "Your condition has progressed faster than we would like, largely because you missed several important appointments and were inconsistent with your medication schedule. We need to adjust your treatment plan immediately, and I strongly recommend you have someone helping monitor your symptoms at home. This is not a condition you should be managing entirely alone." Daniel nodded silently, guilt and fear tightening around his chest in equal measure. He thought about Alina immediately, about how different this conversation might have felt if she had been sitting beside him, holding his hand, asking the doctor questions. Daniel was too overwhelmed to think of himself. Instead, he sat alone in that small room, absorbing devastating news with no one beside him for comfort or support. "What happens if my condition continues declining at this rate?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the fear churning inside him. Dr. Akafer hesitated for a moment before answering honestly. "If we cannot stabilize things soon, we may need to discuss more serious interventions, potentially including surgery or, in more severe cases, a heart transplant evaluation. I don't say this to frighten you unnecessarily, but you need to understand the seriousness of consistent treatment from this point forward. There is very little room left for missed appointments or inconsistent medication." The words landed like a physical blow, and Daniel left the appointment that afternoon feeling more frightened than he had felt since the initial diagnosis months earlier. He sat in his car in the hospital parking lot for nearly 30 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process the reality that his careless neglect had accelerated the very illness he had sacrificed his relationship to protect Alina from witnessing. The irony was not lost on him. In trying to spare her from watching him suffer, he had isolated himself so completely that his health had deteriorated faster without her support and encouragement. His decision, made from what he believed was pure love, had ultimately hurt them both without providing any actual protection for either of them. That evening, Daniel finally worked up the courage to call Marcus, updating him on the doctor's concerning news. Marcus listened carefully, his frustration from their previous conversation now mixed with genuine worry for his friend's well-being. "You need to tell Alina," Marcus said firmly once Daniel finished explaining. "Not eventually, Daniel, soon. She deserves to know the truth, and honestly, you need support right now, whether that comes from her or from people who care about you. You cannot keep doing this alone." "I don't even know where to start," Daniel admitted, exhaustion evident in every word. "How do I even begin explaining something like this? I lied to her, Marcus. I broke her heart intentionally, and now I'm supposed to just show up and tell her it was all because I was scared. She'll never forgive me for that." "Maybe not," Marcus replied honestly, unwilling to offer false comfort. but you owe her the truth regardless of how she chooses to respond. And Daniel, I've known Alina for years too. She's not the type of person to hold on to anger when she understands the full picture. Fear made you do something foolish, but that doesn't mean the love you shared wasn't real. Give her the chance to know the truth, even if it doesn't change anything between you two romantically. She deserves that closure. Daniel spent the following days working up the courage to reach out, drafting messages he never sent, dialing her number only to hang up before the call connected. Each attempt felt more difficult than the last, weighted down by months of guilt and the fear of facing her anger, her hurt, or worse, her complete indifference toward him now. Meanwhile, Alina continued adjusting to her new routine, though something had shifted subtly within her since her conversation with Grace weeks earlier. The nagging feeling that Daniel's explanation had never truly made sense refused to fully disappear, resurfacing during quiet moments when her mind wandered away from the distractions she had carefully built around herself. One afternoon, while organizing old files on her laptop, she accidentally opened a folder containing photographs from their relationship, images she had meant to delete months earlier, but somehow never found the strength to remove permanently. She scrolled through them slowly, pausing on a photograph taken just days before his hospital collapse, a candid shot of Daniel laughing at something she had said, his eyes crinkled with genuine happiness, completely unaware of the health crisis about to upend both their lives. She stared at that photograph for a long time, studying his expression, searching for any hint of the doubt or hesitation he claimed to have been feeling about their relationship. She found none. What she saw instead was a man deeply, genuinely in love, completely present in that moment with her. The disconnect between that image and the cold, distant man who had ended things with her weeks later continued gnawing at her thoughts. She decided almost impulsively to reach out to one of Daniel's coworkers, someone she had met several times during company gatherings, hoping to gain some insight into what might have happened around the time of his hospital visit. The coworker, a friendly woman named Priya, seemed surprised by Alina's questions but shared what little information she remembered. He seemed really shaken after that collapse, Priya explained over the phone. More than just embarrassed about fainting at work, he looked genuinely scared for weeks afterward, and he started missing days here and there which wasn't like him at all. I always assumed it was something serious, though he never really talked about it much with any of us. The conversation left Alina more confused than before, but also more convinced that something significant had happened around that time, something Daniel had chosen to hide from her rather than something that had genuinely changed his feelings about their relationship. She debated for days whether to reach out to him directly, torn between protecting her own healing progress and pursuing answers that increasingly felt necessary for real closure. Finally, nearly 4 months after their breakup, Alina made the decision to send Daniel a simple message, careful not to reveal the depth of her lingering questions or emotions. She kept it brief, professional almost, asking only if they could talk when he had time available. Daniel's heart raced when he saw her name appear on his phone screen after months of silence. His hands trembled as he read her simple message, relief and terror flooding through him simultaneously. This was the opportunity he had been too afraid to create himself, and now it had arrived unexpectedly, offering him a chance at redemption he was not entirely certain he deserved. He responded almost immediately, agreeing to meet her the following weekend at a small cafe they used to frequent during the early years of their relationship, a neutral location that felt significant without being overwhelming for either of them. As the days leading up to their meeting passed, Daniel found himself rehearsing what he wanted to say, drafting explanations and apologies that felt inadequate no matter how carefully he crafted them. He knew this conversation would likely determine not just the future of their relationship, but potentially his own physical well-being as well. Dr. Okafor's warnings about needing proper support at home echoed constantly in his mind, alongside Marcus's insistence that Alina deserved complete honesty regardless of the outcome. Daniel understood, perhaps for the first time since his diagnosis, that continued isolation was not protecting anyone. It was simply prolonging unnecessary suffering for both himself and the woman he had never actually stopped loving. The morning of their scheduled meeting arrived with a heavy fog settling over the city, matching the uncertain weight sitting in Daniel's chest as he prepared to face the consequences of decisions made months earlier from a place of fear rather than genuine wisdom. He arrived at the cafe early, choosing a table near the back, away from the window, wanting privacy for whatever conversation was about to unfold between them. When Alina walked through the door precisely on time, dressed simply but looking more tired than he remembered, something in Daniel's chest tightened painfully, a mixture of love, guilt, and desperate hope colliding all at once. She spotted him immediately, her expression unreadable as she made her way toward his table, sliding into the seat across from him with careful, measured movements. "You wanted to talk," she said simply, her voice neutral, guarded in a way that broke his heart further, knowing he was entirely responsible for building those defenses around her. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every lie he had told over the past several months pressing down on him, threatening to crush whatever courage he had managed to gather. This was it, the moment he had been avoiding, the truth he had convinced himself was too dangerous to share. But sitting across from Alina, seeing the guarded pain still lingering in her eyes despite months of separation, he finally understood what Marcus had been trying to tell him all along. Silence, no matter how well-intentioned, was never actually love. Real love required honesty, even when that honesty was frightening, even when it meant facing the possibility of losing someone completely rather than protecting them through carefully constructed lies. "There's something I need to tell you," Daniel began, his voice trembling slightly despite his attempts to remain composed. "Something I should have told you months ago, before I ever said any of those horrible things that ended our engagement." Alina's guarded expression shifted slightly, curiosity and caution mixing together, as she waited for him to continue. She had no idea that the next several minutes would completely reshape her understanding of everything that had happened between them, nor did she realize just how much courage it was taking Daniel to finally break the silence he had maintained for far too long. Alina waited, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had not yet touched, watching Daniel's face carefully as he searched for the right words. The cafe around them buzzed with quiet conversation and the gentle clinking of cups against saucers, but to Daniel, the entire world had narrowed down to this single table, this single moment, and the woman sitting across from him who deserved far better than he had given her. "I made a mistake," Daniel said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. "Ending things between us the way I did, saying the things I said. None of that was fair to you, Alina. You didn't deserve to be treated that way after everything we built together." Alina's fingers tightened slightly around her cup, her expression carefully neutral despite the emotions clearly swirling beneath the surface. "That's a start," she said cautiously, "but it doesn't explain why you did it in the first place. People don't just wake up one day and decide to destroy something they claim to want forever, Daniel. Something happened. I felt it, even if I couldn't prove it at the time." Daniel's throat tightened, the truth sitting right there on the tip of his tongue, so close to finally being spoken aloud after months of carefully guarded silence. He opened his mouth, ready to tell her everything, the diagnosis, the fear, the misguided belief that pushing her away was somehow an act of protection rather than cruelty. But as he looked into her eyes, still guarded and cautious despite the vulnerability she was clearly allowing herself to show, an old fear resurfaced, gripping his chest just as tightly as his failing heart sometimes did. What if telling her the truth now, after everything, only made things worse? What if she felt obligated to return to him purely out of guilt or pity, rather than genuine love? What if the damage he had already caused was simply too deep to repair, regardless of the reasons behind his actions? "I was scared," Daniel said instead, choosing a half-truth that felt safer than complete honesty. "Scared of commitment, scared of the future, scared of not being enough for you long-term. I panicked, and I handled it in the worst possible way imaginable. I'm not asking you to forgive me or to take me back. I just needed you to know that ending things had nothing to do with anything you did wrong. It was entirely my own fear and my own failure." The explanation, while closer to honest than his previous lies, still fell painfully short of the complete truth Alina deserved to hear. Daniel watched her expression shift slightly, disappointment mixing with the cautious hope she had allowed herself to feel walking into this meeting. "So that's it?" Alina asked, her voice carrying a mixture of hurt and frustration. "You were scared, so you just decided to shatter everything we spent 5 years building. Daniel, I would have understood fear. I would have worked through commitment issues with you if you had just talked to me instead of pushing me away and lying about your feelings entirely." "I know," Daniel said, guilt washing over him in heavy waves. "I know I handled everything wrong. I just wanted you to have the chance to move forward, to find happiness without complications holding you back." Alina studied him carefully, something in his phrasing catching her attention despite his attempt to keep the conversation vague. Complications, she repeated slowly. What kind of complications, Daniel? You keep hinting at something bigger than simple fear of commitment, but you won't actually tell me what that something is. Daniel felt his carefully constructed explanation beginning to unravel under her perceptive questioning, panic rising in his chest as he realized he was dangerously close to either revealing the complete truth or getting caught in an obvious lie. He chose, in that critical moment, to retreat rather than advance, fear once again overpowering his better judgment. "It's complicated," he said, deflecting her question entirely. "I don't think either of us is ready to fully unpack everything today. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry, genuinely sorry for how I handled things. That's really all I wanted to say." Alina sat back in her chair, disappointment settling clearly across her features. She had hoped, perhaps naively, that this meeting would provide the closure she desperately needed, real answers instead of vague apologies wrapped in half-truths. Instead, she found herself leaving with more questions than she had arrived with, the nagging feeling that something significant remained hidden, refusing to fade despite Daniel's partial confession. "Thank you for the apology," she said finally, gathering her things to leave. "I hope you figure out whatever it is you're actually running from, Daniel. I really do. But I can't keep chasing half-truths hoping they eventually become whole ones. If you ever decide you're ready to be completely honest with me, you know how to find me." She left the cafe without looking back, leaving Daniel sitting alone at the table, his untouched coffee growing cold in front of him. He had come so close to finally telling her everything, yet fear had once again convinced him that silence, or at least partial silence, remained the safer choice. He did not yet understand that this decision, this final missed opportunity for complete honesty, would soon prove to be one of the most costly mistakes of his entire life. Over the following weeks, Daniel's health continued its steady, dangerous decline. Despite Dr. Akaffer's warnings, despite Marcus's constant urging to prioritize proper treatment and support, Daniel found himself slipping back into old patterns of neglect, overwhelmed by guilt over his failed conversation with Alina and increasingly hopeless about his own future. He attended his medical appointments inconsistently, sometimes forgetting entirely, other times canceling last minute when the emotional weight of his situation felt too heavy to face alone in a doctor's office. Marcus noticed the regression almost immediately, growing increasingly frustrated and worried as he watched his friend spiral deeper into isolation and declining health. He tried repeatedly to intervene, showing up unannounced at Daniel's apartment, calling multiple times throughout each week, even accompanying Daniel to one particularly difficult appointment when Daniel seemed unable to face it alone. But despite Marcus's persistent efforts, Daniel remained trapped in a cycle of guilt, fear, and self-destructive avoidance that seemed impossible to break. "You had the chance to tell her everything," Marcus said one evening, frustration evident in his voice as he sat across from Daniel in the increasingly cluttered and neglected apartment. "Why didn't you just tell her the truth when you had her sitting right there in front of you?" "I was afraid," Daniel admitted quietly, staring down at his hands. "Afraid that even knowing the truth wouldn't change anything, that I had already damaged things too badly to repair. Afraid that if I told her everything and she still walked away, I wouldn't be able to handle that kind of rejection on top of everything else happening in my life right now. So instead you chose to keep suffering alone, pushing away the one person who genuinely loved you enough to fight for the truth," Marcus replied, his voice softening despite his obvious frustration. "Daniel, you cannot keep making decisions from a place of fear. Look at what it's already cost you. Look at what it's costing your health right now. You need to stop running from vulnerability and start facing it head-on, before it's too late for you to have any say in how this story ends." Daniel nodded silently, understanding the truth in Marcus's words even as he struggled to find the courage necessary to act on them. He told himself he would try again soon, that he would find the right moment, the right words, to finally give Alina the complete honesty she deserved. But as his physical health continued deteriorating with each passing week, that promised moment kept slipping further out of reach, buried beneath exhaustion, fear, and a persistent, dangerous belief that he somehow deserved to suffer alone for the pain he had caused. Alina, meanwhile, found herself unable to fully move past the strange, incomplete conversation from the cafe. Grace continued gently encouraging her to seek further answers, sensing that her sister's healing remained stalled. caught in a limbo of unresolved questions rather than genuine closure. But Alina, exhausted by the emotional toll of chasing half-truths, decided instead to focus entirely on rebuilding her own independent life, promising herself she would not reach out to Daniel again unless he came to her first with complete, unguarded honesty. Neither of them realized, as the weeks continued passing in painful silence, just how little time remained before circumstances would force the truth into the open, regardless of Daniel's continued fear and hesitation. The countdown clock ticking quietly inside his failing heart had grown louder than either of them understood, and soon, neither pride nor fear would matter nearly as much as the simple, desperate need for survival. The evening it happened started like any other quiet, lonely evening in Daniel's apartment. He had come home from work exhausted, his breathing labored even after the short walk from his car to his front door. He told himself, as he had told himself countless times over the past several weeks, that he simply needed rest, that tomorrow he would call Dr. Akaffer and finally commit to taking his treatment seriously again. He made himself a simple dinner he barely touched, then settled onto his couch, intending only to rest his eyes for a few minutes before addressing the growing pile of unopened mail sitting on his kitchen counter. He did not know, as his eyes grew heavy and his breathing grew shallow, that his heart had reached a critical breaking point that evening, the culmination of months of neglect, missed medications, and unaddressed stress finally converging into a dangerous, life-threatening episode. Sometime around 8 in the evening, Daniel's heart began beating erratically, an arrhythmia triggered by the severely weakened state of his heart muscle after months without proper medical management. He woke suddenly, gasping for air, his chest gripped by a pain unlike anything he had experienced even during his initial collapse months earlier. His vision blurred at the edges, his limbs felt impossibly heavy, and a cold sweat broke out across his entire body as panic set in. He reached desperately for his phone sitting on the coffee table, his fingers trembling so badly he could barely manage to unlock the screen. He tried calling for emergency help, but his vision continued darkening at the edges, the pain in his chest intensifying with each passing second. Somewhere in the depths of his panic, some instinct guided his shaking fingers toward Marcus's contact information instead, perhaps understanding that his oldest friend would recognize the severity of the situation faster than any stranger on an emergency line. The call connected, and Marcus answered cheerfully, expecting a casual conversation about weekend plans. Instead, he heard labored, gasping breathing on the other end, followed by Daniel's weak, terrified voice barely managing to speak. "Marcus," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "Something's wrong, my chest, I can't breathe properly." Marcus's entire body went cold with fear, adrenaline instantly flooding his system as he grabbed his car keys, already moving toward the door while keeping Daniel on the line. "Daniel, stay with me, okay? I'm calling an ambulance right now and I'm coming straight to your apartment. Do not hang up this phone." Marcus quickly called for emergency medical assistance while simultaneously racing toward his car, providing Daniel's address to the dispatcher with a shaking voice he barely recognized as his own. Throughout the frantic drive across town, he kept Daniel talking, desperately trying to keep his friend conscious and focused, terrified of what silence on the other end of the line might mean. "Talk to me, Daniel," Marcus said urgently, weaving through traffic as quickly as he safely could. "Tell me something, anything. Stay awake, please." Daniel's responses grew increasingly weak and disjointed as the minutes passed, his breathing becoming more labored, his consciousness beginning to slip in and out despite his desperate attempts to remain alert. "I'm sorry," he managed to whisper at one point, his voice thick with emotion despite his physical weakness. "I'm sorry I never told her the truth, Marcus. I'm sorry I wasted so much time being afraid." "You're not dying tonight," Marcus said firmly, refusing to accept any alternative outcome as he pushed his car faster through the darkening streets. "You hear me? You are going to get through this, and then you are going to fix things properly. Do you understand me, Daniel? This is not how your story ends." By the time Marcus arrived at the apartment, breaking in through the door when Daniel could no longer manage to unlock it himself, his friend had lost consciousness entirely, his breathing dangerously shallow, his skin pale and clammy. Marcus's training from a basic first aid course years earlier kicked in instinctively, checking for a pulse, positioning Daniel carefully, and continuing to speak to him despite receiving no response, desperately hoping some part of his friend could still hear him. The paramedics arrived minutes later, working quickly and efficiently to stabilize Daniel before rushing him to the hospital, sirens cutting through the quiet evening streets with an urgency that mirrored the panic still coursing through Marcus's veins as he followed behind in his own car, his hands shaking too badly to grip the steering wheel properly. At the hospital, medical staff rushed Daniel into emergency care, working to stabilize his heart rhythm and address the severe complications that had developed from months of inconsistent treatment. Marcus paced the waiting room helplessly, unable to do anything except wait for updates, his mind racing through every conversation he had ever had with Daniel about his health, wondering desperately if there was something more he could have done to prevent this crisis from occurring. Hours passed before a doctor finally emerged to speak with Marcus, explaining that Daniel had experienced a severe cardiac event, but that the medical team had successfully stabilized his heart rhythm and he was now resting in the intensive care unit. His condition remained serious, the doctor explained carefully, and the coming days would be critical in determining his long-term prognosis and next steps for treatment. Marcus sank into a nearby chair, relief and exhaustion washing over him simultaneously as he processed the news that his friend had survived this immediate crisis. But as he sat there in the quiet hospital corridor, Daniel's whispered apology from the phone call replayed repeatedly in his mind, the desperate confession about never telling Alina the complete truth weighing heavily on his conscience. Marcus understood, in that exhausted, emotional moment, that he could no longer stand by and watch his friend continue suffering in isolated silence, regardless of Daniel's own hesitation and fear. Someone needed to tell Alina the truth, and if Daniel remained too afraid or too physically weak to do so himself, Marcus decided he would take on that responsibility, understanding fully that it might mean betraying his friend's trust in the short term, but believing firmly that it represented the only path toward genuine healing for both of them. He waited until visiting hours allowed him brief access to Daniel's room, finding his friend awake but weak, hooked up to numerous monitors and intravenous lines, his face pale against the white hospital pillows. Daniel managed a small, tired smile when he saw Marcus enter the room, gratitude evident in his exhausted expression. "You came," Daniel whispered, his voice still weak from the ordeal his body had endured. "Of course I came," Marcus replied, pulling a chair closer to the bed. "You scared me half to death tonight, Daniel. I thought I might actually lose you." "I'm still here," Daniel said softly, though the uncertainty in his voice suggested he understood just how close he had come to a very different outcome. "Barely, but I'm still here." Marcus studied his friend carefully, considering how to approach the conversation weighing heavily on his mind. He knew Daniel was still fragile, both physically and emotionally, but he also understood that continued silence had already cost them all too much time, too much unnecessary suffering that honesty could have prevented from the very beginning. "Daniel, I need to talk to you about something important," Marcus said carefully, watching his friend's expression shift with cautious apprehension. "About Alina and about what happens next." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, exhaustion and shame washing over his features simultaneously. "I know I need to tell her," he whispered. "I know I've run out of time to keep hiding behind fear. I think it might be time for someone else to help you find the courage to finally do that," Marcus said gently, his decision already firmly made despite the uncertainty of how his friend might react to what he was about to propose. "Because Daniel, tonight proved that you cannot keep carrying this alone anymore. None of us can afford for you to keep making that same mistake." Daniel looked up at his friend, understanding slowly dawning in his tired eyes as he realized exactly what Marcus was suggesting. For a moment, panic flickered across his features, the familiar fear of losing control over his own carefully hidden truth resurfacing despite everything that had just happened. But then, exhaustion and a genuine, desperate longing for honesty finally overcame that fear entirely. "Tell her," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking slightly with the weight of finally surrendering months of carefully guarded secrecy. "Tell her everything, Marcus. I can't keep doing this alone anymore. I don't want to keep doing this alone anymore." Marcus nodded, understanding the significance of what his friend had just entrusted him with. He squeezed Daniel's hand gently before standing to leave the room, already pulling out his phone as he walked into the hospital corridor, preparing to make a call that would change everything for both Daniel and Alina, regardless of how she chose to respond to the truth he was finally about to share with her. Alina's phone rang late that evening, an unfamiliar number flashing across her screen as she sat curled on her couch grading a stack of student assignments. She almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was likely a telemarketer or wrong number, but something made her answer anyway, a strange instinct she could not fully explain even to herself later. "Hello," she said cautiously. "Elena, it's Marcus. Marcus Webb, Daniel's friend. I'm sorry to call so late, but I need to talk to you about something important, and I didn't know who else to reach out to." Elena's heart immediately began racing, fear and confusion colliding as she sat up straighter on her couch. "Marcus, is everything okay? Is Daniel all right?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and in that pause, Elena's stomach dropped, instinctively understanding that whatever Marcus was about to tell her would not be simple or easy to hear. "Daniel is stable right now, but he's in the hospital," Marcus said carefully. "He had a serious health emergency tonight, a cardiac event. He's going to be okay for now, but Elena, there's something you need to know, something he should have told you months ago, and I think it's finally time you heard the complete truth." Over the following 20 minutes, Marcus explained everything he knew, starting with Daniel's original diagnosis months earlier, the fear that had consumed him after learning about his heart condition, and the misguided belief that pushing Elena away represented an act of protective love rather than devastating betrayal. He explained the months of neglected treatment, the missed appointments, and the isolation that had ultimately contributed to the health crisis that had landed Daniel in the hospital earlier that evening. Elena listened in stunned silence, her mind struggling to reconcile this new information with the cold, dismissive man who had ended their engagement months earlier. Tears began streaming down her face as pieces of confusing, painful memories suddenly rearranged themselves into a picture that finally made sense, though the picture itself broke her heart in an entirely different way than she had experienced before. "He lied to me," Elena said finally, her voice thick with a complicated mixture of emotions she could barely untangle. "He made me believe I wasn't enough, that our entire relationship meant nothing to him, all because he was trying to protect me from something I would have gladly faced beside him." "I know," Marcus replied gently, "and I know that doesn't erase the pain he caused you or excuse the way he handled everything. But Elena, I've watched him suffer alone for months, slowly making himself sicker through isolation and shame, all because he genuinely believed, however wrongly, that he was sparing you from suffering. He almost died tonight, partly because he refused to let anyone properly take care of him after pushing you away." Elena sat in silence for a long moment, overwhelmed by grief, anger, and an unexpected surge of protective love that refused to fully disappear despite months of heartbreak and forced distance. She thought about every strange, disconnected piece of their final conversations, the hospital visit right before everything fell apart, his vague explanations at the cafe weeks earlier, Priya's comment about how shaken he had seemed after his initial collapse. All of it suddenly clicked into place, painting a picture of a man drowning in fear rather than a man who had genuinely stopped loving her. "Why didn't he just tell me?" Elena finally whispered, more to herself than to Marcus. "I would have stayed, I would have fought through this with him, no matter how difficult it became." "I think that's exactly why he was so afraid," Marcus said softly. "He didn't doubt your love, Elena. He doubted his own right to accept it, given everything he thought you would have to sacrifice because of his illness. It wasn't logical, and it definitely wasn't fair to you, but it came from a place of love twisted by fear rather than genuine indifference." Elena wiped her tears away, her mind racing through a complicated whirlwind of emotions, anger toward the lies mixing uncomfortably with overwhelming concern for the man she still, despite everything, clearly still loved. "Which hospital is he at?" she finally asked, her voice steadier now, resolve beginning to replace confusion. Marcus provided the details, relief evident in his voice as he realized Elena's immediate instinct was concern rather than complete rejection. "Elena, I want you to know he asked me to tell you. He finally understood tonight that he couldn't keep hiding the truth any longer. This wasn't me going behind his back. This was him finally ready to stop being afraid." After ending the call, Elena sat frozen on her couch for several minutes, processing months of confusion, pain, and unanswered questions that had suddenly resolved themselves into painful clarity. Part of her wanted to remain angry, to protect herself from further heartbreak, by refusing to immediately rush to his side after everything he had put her through. But a much stronger part of her, the part that had never actually stopped loving him despite months of forced separation, refused to let pride keep her away from him during what could have been, and still might become, a life-threatening crisis. She grabbed her car keys and jacket, tears still drying on her cheeks, and drove toward the hospital with a mixture of fear, hope, and complicated love guiding every mile of the journey. Throughout the drive, she replayed countless memories from their 5 years together, searching for any lingering doubt about her decision to see him, but finding only a persistent, undeniable pull toward the man who had, despite everything, made the worst decision of his life out of a broken, misguided attempt to protect her. Grace called partway through her drive, having received a brief message from Alina explaining the situation. "Are you sure about this?" Grace asked carefully, concern evident in her voice. "After everything he put you through, are you really ready to walk back into that hospital room?" "I don't know if I'm ready," Alina admitted honestly, gripping the steering wheel tightly as tears threatened to blur her vision again. "But I know I can't just stay away, Grace. Not after everything Marcus just told me. He was drowning in fear this entire time, and I was so caught up in my own hurt that I never considered there might be something deeper going on. I need to see him. I need to hear the truth directly from him, and I need him to know that no matter how angry I might be about the lies, I never actually stopped caring about what happens to him." Grace remained quiet for a moment before responding gently. "Just protect your heart too, okay? Whatever happens tonight, make sure you're taking care of yourself through all of this as well." Alina promised she would, though as she pulled into the hospital parking lot minutes later, her heart pounding with a complicated mixture of anticipation and lingering hurt, she understood that protecting her own heart while walking toward someone she deeply loved, someone fighting for his own survival, felt like an impossibly complicated balance to maintain. She walked through the hospital doors, her legs slightly unsteady beneath her, following the directions the front desk provided toward the intensive care unit where Marcus had told her Daniel was currently resting. Every step down that sterile, brightly lit corridor felt heavier than the last, 5 years of complicated history colliding with months of painful separation and newly discovered truth, all converging toward a single, uncertain moment she could not fully predict or control. As she approached the correct room number, she could see Marcus standing just outside the door, his expression shifting to relief when he spotted her walking toward him. He offered her a small, encouraging nod before stepping aside, giving her the privacy and space needed for whatever conversation was about to unfold between her and the man she had once promised to spend the rest of her life beside. Alina paused at the doorway, taking a deep, steadying breath before finally pushing the door open and stepping into the room where Daniel lay connected to numerous machines, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling with careful, monitored breaths. She had no idea, standing there in that quiet doorway, just how much this single moment was about to change the remainder of both their lives. Daniel's eyes fluttered open at the soft sound of the door closing, and for a moment, he wondered if exhaustion and medication were causing him to imagine things. But as his vision cleared, he saw her standing there at the foot of his bed, real and present, her eyes red from crying, her expression a complicated mixture of hurt, relief, and something that looked remarkably like love despite everything he had put her through. "Alina," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion, disbelief, and overwhelming gratitude all colliding at once. "You came." "Marcus told me everything," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she moved closer to his bedside, though she stopped short of reaching for his hand, keeping a careful, protective distance despite the obvious pull she felt toward him. "About your diagnosis, about why you really ended things between us. About tonight." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, shame and relief washing over him simultaneously. "I should have told you the truth from the very beginning," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was so afraid of what my illness would take from you, from your future, that I convinced myself pushing you away was somehow an act of love. I was wrong, Alina. I was so wrong, and I'm sorrier than I could ever properly express." Tears streamed down Alina's face as she finally moved closer, pulling a chair beside his bed and sitting down carefully, her hand hesitantly reaching for his. "Do you have any idea what those months were like for me?" she asked, her voice breaking with the weight of accumulated pain. "I thought I wasn't enough for you. I thought 5 years meant nothing. I blamed myself for things that were never actually my fault, all because you decided you knew better than I did what I could handle." "I know," Daniel whispered, guilt evident in every syllable. "And I have no excuse good enough to make up for the pain I caused you. I was terrified, Alina. Terrified of watching you sacrifice your future for a man who might not have much time left. Terrified of becoming a burden instead of a partner. But sitting here tonight, after nearly losing everything because I refused to let anyone help me, I finally understand how badly I misunderstood what real love actually means." Alina wiped her tears away, studying his face carefully, searching for the same genuine sincerity she used to see so clearly whenever he spoke to her in the past. She found it there now, raw and unguarded in a way she had not witnessed since before his diagnosis had first entered their lives. "Real love isn't about deciding for someone else what they can and cannot handle," she said softly, her voice steadying despite the emotion still evident beneath her words. "Real love is trusting that person enough to let them choose for themselves, even when that choice involves difficulty and sacrifice. Daniel, I would have stayed. I would have fought beside you through every single appointment, every treatment, every difficult day, because that is what loving someone actually means. You didn't spare me from suffering by pushing me away. You just replaced one kind of pain with an entirely different, more confusing kind of heartbreak." Daniel nodded slowly, tears finally escaping down his own cheeks as the full weight of his mistake settled completely into his understanding for the very first time. "I understand that now," he whispered. "I understand it in a way I wish I had understood months ago, before I caused you so much unnecessary pain." They sat together in comfortable, healing silence for several minutes, her hand remaining gently wrapped around his, both of them processing the enormity of everything that had unfolded between them over the past several months. Eventually, Alina spoke again, her voice softer now, though still carrying the weight of legitimate hurt that would take considerable time to fully heal. "I'm not saying everything is instantly okay between us," she said carefully. "You hurt me deeply, Daniel, and rebuilding trust after something like this takes real time and consistent honesty. But I'm here right now because despite everything, I never actually stopped loving you. And I refuse to let fear, yours or mine, keep either of us from facing whatever comes next together, if you're willing to let me back in completely this time." "I promise," Daniel said, his voice trembling with sincere, unwavering conviction. "No more secrets, no more decisions made from fear instead of honesty. Whatever time I have left, however long that turns out to be, I want to spend it being completely truthful with you, even when that truth is difficult or frightening." Over the following days, as Daniel remained hospitalized for continued monitoring and treatment adjustments, Alina stayed by his side consistently, asking Dr. Akafor detailed questions about his condition, learning everything she could about how best to support his ongoing treatment and recovery. Marcus visited regularly as well, relief evident on his face each time he witnessed the genuine reconciliation slowly unfolding between his two closest friends. Dr. Akafor, pleased to see Daniel finally receiving proper support and encouragement, worked with the couple to establish a comprehensive treatment plan that included consistent medication management, regular monitoring appointments, and lifestyle adjustments designed to give Daniel the best possible chance at long-term stability. With Alina's steady presence and encouragement, Daniel found himself far more committed to following through with his treatment than he had managed during the isolated months following their painful separation. "You know," Daniel said one afternoon, several days into his hospital stay, as Alina sat beside his bed reading quietly while he rested, "I used to think being strong meant handling everything alone, protecting the people I love by carrying burdens by myself. But I think I finally understand that real strength actually looks like letting someone love you through difficulty, rather than pushing them away to spare them from it." Alina looked up from her book, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through months of accumulated hurt and healing. "That sounds like real progress," she said softly. "It is," Daniel replied, reaching for her hand once again. "And it's because of you and because of Marcus refusing to let me keep hiding. I still have a difficult road ahead of me, Alina. This condition isn't going away, and there will likely be challenging days ahead for both of us. But I want to face all of it honestly, with you beside me, rather than alone in silence like I foolishly tried to do before." Alina squeezed his hand gently, her eyes reflecting a complicated mixture of remaining hurt, cautious hope, and unwavering love that had somehow survived months of painful separation and devastating lies. "Then let's face it together," she said simply, "one honest day at a time." 3 weeks later, Daniel was discharged from the hospital with a carefully structured treatment plan, strict medication adherence, and regular follow-up appointments scheduled well into the future. Alina had moved back into their old apartment with him, not immediately resuming their engagement, but committed to rebuilding trust through consistent honesty and genuine partnership. Marcus remained a constant, supportive presence throughout their ongoing healing process, grateful to have played a role in finally breaking the destructive silence that had nearly cost his closest friend everything. Their relationship in those following months looked different than it had before Daniel's diagnosis, marked by deeper conversations, greater vulnerability, and a hard-earned understanding that genuine love required facing difficulty together rather than attempting to shoulder burdens alone. Elena attended every medical appointment alongside him, learning to recognize warning signs, celebrating small improvements in his condition, and providing steady emotional support during the inevitable difficult days that still occasionally arose. 6 months after that devastating night in the hospital, Daniel proposed to Elena again, this time with complete honesty about everything his illness might mean for their shared future. Sitting on the same hill where he had originally proposed years earlier, he held her hands and spoke without hesitation or hidden fear. "I cannot promise you an easy future," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "My heart will always require careful management, and there may be difficult days ahead that neither of us can fully predict. But I can promise you complete honesty, unwavering partnership, and a love strong enough to face whatever challenges come our way, together rather than in isolated silence. Elena, will you marry me again, knowing everything now, choosing this future with your eyes completely open?" Elena, tears streaming down her face, did not hesitate before answering. "I never stopped choosing you," she said softly. "Not even during the months I believed you had stopped choosing me. Yes, Daniel. 1,000 times yes, with complete honesty as our foundation this time." Their story, born from fear and nearly destroyed by well-intentioned lies, ultimately transformed into something stronger and more resilient than it had been before, built upon the hard-learned understanding that true love requires vulnerability and honesty rather than silent sacrifice. Daniel's heart condition remained a constant presence in their lives, requiring ongoing care and attention, but it no longer represented a secret burden carried alone. Instead, it became simply one part of the honest, complicated, deeply committed life they continued building together, one truthful day at a time. 2 years passed after that second proposal on the hill, and the wedding Daniel and Elena eventually held was small, intimate, and filled with a kind of quiet gratitude that only comes after surviving something that nearly tore two people apart forever. Marcus stood beside Daniel as his best man, and Grace stood beside Elena, both of them watching with tearful pride as the couple exchanged vows that carried far more weight than most, having already tested and survived the very worst version of what dishonesty and fear could do to a relationship. Daniel's health remained a steady presence throughout those years, neither dramatically improving nor drastically declining, settling instead into the kind of manageable rhythm Dr. Ockhaffer had once described as possible for patients who committed fully to consistent treatment. There were still difficult days, moments of fatigue that reminded them both of the fragility hiding beneath their everyday happiness, appointments that occasionally brought concerning news requiring medication adjustments or additional monitoring. But through all of it, Elena remained steadily present, no longer an outsider kept in the dark, but a full partner navigating every challenge alongside him. They opened Elena's tutoring center together during their 2nd year of marriage, a small business she had dreamed about long before Daniel's diagnosis had ever entered their lives. Daniel helped design the space himself, using his architectural skills to create a warm, welcoming environment filled with natural light and comfortable reading corners where students could focus and grow. Watching her dream come to life, rather than watching it die under the weight of his illness as he had once feared, became one of the greatest joys of Daniel's life, proof that his original fear had been built on a false assumption about what love and partnership actually required. One evening, nearly 3 years after his initial diagnosis, Daniel experienced another concerning episode, a brief irregular heartbeat that sent both of them rushing to the emergency room, fear resurfacing instantly despite years of relative stability. But this time, everything unfolded differently. Elena sat beside him throughout every test, held his hand through every anxious moment, and asked the doctors detailed questions with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning about his condition rather than being shielded from it. "I'm scared," Daniel admitted quietly, waiting for test results in the emergency room, old fears momentarily threatening to resurface despite everything they had built together. "I know," Elena said gently, squeezing his hand. "But you're not scared alone this time. That makes all the difference, doesn't it?" Daniel nodded, understanding fully now what he had failed to grasp during those isolated, painful months years earlier. Fear itself had never been the true enemy in their story. The real danger had always been facing that fear in silence, believing that love meant protecting someone from difficulty rather than facing difficulty honestly together. The episode that evening turned out to be manageable, requiring only a minor medication adjustment, but the experience reinforced something they had both come to understand deeply over the years of rebuilding their relationship. Marcus remained a constant presence in their lives throughout this period, often joining them for dinner, celebrating milestones alongside them, and occasionally reminding Daniel, with the easy familiarity of old friendship, just how close he had come to losing everything through his own misguided attempt at protective silence. "You know," Marcus said one evening over dinner, watching Daniel and Alina interact with the comfortable ease of two people who had rebuilt genuine trust, "I think about that phone call sometimes, how close things came to ending very differently." "I think about it too," Daniel admitted, glancing toward Alina with quiet gratitude evident in his expression. "Every single day, honestly. It reminds me never to take this kind of honesty for granted again." As the years continued passing, Daniel and Alina eventually welcomed a daughter into their family, a decision they approached carefully, consulting extensively with Dr. Okafor about the physical demands pregnancy and parenthood might place on Daniel's condition, and about strategies for managing his health while raising a young child together. Their daughter, a bright-eyed girl they named after Daniel's late father, grew up surrounded by a household built on hard-earned honesty rather than protective secrecy. Daniel often thought, watching his daughter grow through her early years, about how differently his life might have unfolded had Marcus not intervened that critical night, had Alina not found the strength and grace to walk back into that hospital room despite months of accumulated hurt and betrayal. He understood now, in a way he could never have grasped during those early, frightened months following his diagnosis, that vulnerability was not a weakness to hide from those he loved, but rather the very foundation upon which genuine, lasting love was built. He began speaking occasionally at local support groups for individuals recently diagnosed with chronic heart conditions, sharing his own story honestly, including the painful mistakes he had made and the lessons he had learned through nearly losing everything that mattered most to him. He spoke about the danger of believing that isolation represented protection, about the importance of allowing loved ones to choose for themselves how much difficulty they were willing to face alongside someone they loved, rather than making that choice unilaterally out of fear disguised as selflessness. "I thought I was being noble," Daniel told one particular group of newly diagnosed patients and their families, Alina sitting quietly in the audience, her expression reflecting the pride she felt watching her husband transform his painful past into something that might genuinely help others avoid similar mistakes. "I thought protecting the people I loved meant carrying my burden entirely alone, but real protection, real love, actually looks like trust. It looks like giving the people who love you the respect of letting them choose to stand beside you through difficulty, rather than deciding for them that they cannot handle it." After the session ended, a young man approached Daniel privately, his own recent diagnosis clearly weighing heavily on his expression, fear evident in the careful way he chose his words. "How did you know when it was finally the right time to be completely honest with the people you love?" he asked quietly. Daniel considered the question carefully before answering, remembering his own painful journey toward that understanding. "Honestly, I wish I had known from the very beginning," he admitted. "I wasted months causing unnecessary pain to myself and to someone I loved deeply, all because I convinced myself that silence was somehow kinder than honesty. The right time is always now. Whatever you're facing, whatever fear is convincing you that isolation protects the people you love, I promise you that honesty, even when it's frightening, is always kinder in the long run than the alternative." The young man nodded thoughtfully, clearly processing Daniel's words alongside his own uncertain path forward. Alina joined them a few minutes later, offering her own perspective as someone who had experienced firsthand the pain of being deliberately kept in the dark, followed by the eventual healing that honest partnership had ultimately provided. "If someone you love is trying to protect you by pushing you away," she said gently, "don't accept that as an act of love. Push back, ask questions, refuse to let fear disguise itself as kindness. You deserve the truth, and so does the person trying so desperately, however wrongly, to protect you from it." As Daniel and Alina drove home that evening, their young daughter asleep in her car seat behind them, Daniel reached over and took Alina's hand, gratitude washing over him as it often did during quiet moments like this one. "Thank you," he said simply, "for coming back that night, for choosing honesty and partnership over the easier path of walking away entirely." Alina squeezed his hand gently, her eyes reflecting years of hard-earned trust and rebuilt love. "Thank you for finally trusting me enough to let me in completely," she replied. "We built something stronger than either of us could have imagined possible, precisely because we learned, however painfully, exactly what happens when fear tries to replace honesty in a relationship built on real love." Their story, one that began with devastating lies born from misguided love, ultimately became a testament to the resilience possible when two people commit to facing life's most difficult challenges with complete, unwavering honesty rather than protective silence. Daniel's heart, once a source of secret fear and painful isolation, eventually became simply one more shared chapter in a life built on trust, partnership, and the hard-learned understanding that true love never requires anyone to suffer entirely alone.